Freezing Bear and her cubs beg to be let into the house. What happens next is shocking. Deep in the unforgiving Alaskan wilderness, survival is a delicate balance, a battle between instinct and the merciless forces of nature. Jack Lawson knew this world better than most. A renowned wildlife photographer turned recluse, he had spent 15 years capturing the raw beauty of the wild, living by one unbreakable rule: observe, but never interfere. But one fateful winter night, that rule was shattered. A blizzard raged outside his cabin, the wind howling like a wounded beast. Then, through the snow and darkness, came an unexpected visitor, a massive grizzly bear. And she wasn't alone. Two small cubs clung to her, their bodies trembling from the bitter cold. But it was her eyes, intelligent, pleading, desperate, that stopped Jack cold. Every survival instinct screamed at him to stay inside, to lock the door, to remember that nature follows its own brutal laws. But as the storm raged on and the mother bear placed her paws against his window, Jack realized he was faced with a choice that would change everything. What happened next would defy logic, challenge everything he thought he knew about the wild, and forge a bond that no one would believe. Because sometimes, the most dangerous thing in nature is compassion. Welcome back. Before we start, remember to hit the like and subscribe for new stories every day. Jack Lawson had always preferred the company of wildlife to people. It wasn't that he disliked humans, he simply found more peace in the quiet observation of creatures who made no demands beyond their natural existence. At 47, with salt and pepper hair that he rarely bothered to tame and eyes the color of weathered blue slate, Jack had built a life around capturing images of animals that few would ever see in person. His small cabin, nestled deep in the Alaskan wilderness 20 miles from the nearest town of Whitethorn, had been his home for nearly 15 years. The locals knew him as that camera guy, the British expat who occasionally emerged from the woods to develop his photographs, stock up on supplies, and disappear again for months at a time. Few knew about his prestigious awards or the gallery exhibitions of his work in New York and London. Jack preferred it that way. On this particular December morning, Jack stood by his cabin window, watching the sky with growing concern. The weather report he'd picked up on his satellite radio warned of an approaching storm system, but what was materializing looked far more menacing than predicted. Massive, purple-gray clouds churned above the tree line, and the wind had already begun to howl through the dense forest that surrounded his home. "Bloody hell," he muttered, reaching for his thermal jacket. "Better get everything secured." Jack stepped outside, the cold air immediately stinging his face as he made his way to the small shed where he kept extra firewood. The temperature had dropped significantly in just the past hour, and he could smell the metallic scent of impending snow. His instincts told him this wasn't going to be an ordinary Alaska winter storm. The animals were too quiet, the air too still beneath the growing wind. Something severe was coming. After stacking extra firewood by his door and checking that his generator had enough fuel, Jack returned inside and began preparing for what might be several days of isolation. He filled containers with water, checked his food supplies, and gathered his emergency equipment, lanterns, his medical kit, and extra blankets. As dusk approached, the storm unleashed its fury. Snow fell not in gentle flakes but in blinding, horizontal sheets driven by winds that shook the sturdy cabin to its foundation. Jack stoked the fire in his wood stove and tried to focus on organizing his most recent photographs, a series of wolf packs hunting in the early winter, but his mind kept returning to the animals out in the storm. This kind of weather could be deadly, even for creatures adapted to Alaska's harsh conditions. It was just past 8 o'clock when he heard the first sound. At first, Jack dismissed it as the wind battering something loose on the cabin's exterior. But when it came again, a distinct scratching followed by a low, rumbling moan, he knew it wasn't the storm. Jack grabbed his rifle from its rack near the door, more from habit than intention. In 15 years of wilderness living, he'd learned that caution kept you alive. Approaching the window cautiously, he peered out into the swirling white darkness, his powerful flashlight cutting through the blizzard. What he saw froze him in place. Standing on his porch, her massive body covered in snow and ice, was a female grizzly bear. Under normal circumstances, this would be cause for serious alarm, but what made Jack lower his rifle slightly was the desperate look in the animal's eyes and the two small forms huddled against her legs. Cubs, no more than a year old, shivering violently in the brutal cold. The mother bear rose on her hind legs and placed her massive paws against the window, not in aggression but in a gesture that seemed almost human in its pleading. Her breath fogged the glass as she stared directly into Jack's eyes. Every wilderness survival rule, Every piece of common sense shouted in Jack's mind. Never allow wild animals, especially predators, into your living space. Never approach bear cubs. Never trust a mother bear. Yet something deeper than training or reason spoke to him as he watched ice forming on the cub's fur. One of them had collapsed onto the porch boards, its small body trembling uncontrollably. "Christ almighty," Jack whispered, setting the rifle aside. "You'll get us both killed." The choice he made in that moment defied everything he knew about wilderness survival. Jack Lawson, who had spent his life observing but never interfering with nature, unlatched his cabin door and swung it wide, stepping back into the center of the room with his heart thundering in his chest. The mother bear didn't charge. She didn't roar or swipe with her lethal claws. Instead, she gently nudged her cubs forward, urging them into the warm sanctuary of the cabin with soft grunts. The stronger cub stumbled in first, followed by its sibling, who could barely walk. The mother entered last, her enormous form seeming to fill the small cabin as she shook snow from her coat. Jack stood perfectly still, barely breathing as the bears moved toward the wood stove. The heat seemed to be their only concern as the cubs collapsed onto the rug before the fire. The mother bear remained standing, her eyes never leaving Jack as she positioned herself between her cubs and the human. "I'm not going to hurt them," Jack said quietly, knowing the bear couldn't understand his words but hoping his tone might convey his intentions. "You're safe here until the storm passes." The absurdity of the situation wasn't lost on him. Here he was, talking to a creature that could kill him with a single swipe, a predator whose natural wariness of humans had been temporarily suspended by something more powerful, maternal instinct and desperation. Slowly, carefully, Jack moved toward his small kitchen area, maintaining eye contact with the mother bear. He filled a large pot with water and placed it on the wood stove, then retrieved several old towels from a cabinet. The bear watched his every move but made no aggressive gestures. "Your little ones need to warm up slowly," he explained, as if she could understand. Too much heat too quickly could hurt them. Over the next few hours, Jack witnessed something few humans ever would, the tender care of a mother grizzly for her cubs in close quarters. She licked the smaller cub continuously, stimulating its circulation, while positioning both cubs to receive the stove's warmth. The larger cub recovered quickly, becoming alert and even curious about its surroundings, though it stayed close to its mother. The smaller cub worried Jack. Its breathing was rapid and shallow, and it showed little response to its mother's attentions. Making a decision that most would consider suicidal, Jack moistened a towel with warm water and slowly approached. "I need to help the little one," he said softly, kneeling a few feet away from the bears. "Please don't kill me for trying." The mother bear rose partially, a low growl emanating from her throat. Jack remained still, holding out the warm towel so she could smell it. After a tense moment that felt like eternity, she settled back down, her eyes watchful but allowing Jack to inch closer. With movements so slow they were barely perceptible, Jack placed the warm, damp towel over the smallest cub. Its mother immediately sniffed the towel, then to Jack's amazement, used her own paw to press it more firmly against her cub's body. "That's it," Jack encouraged, retreating to give them space. "He needs that warmth." Throughout that long night, as the storm raged outside with increasing ferocity, Jack maintained a respectful distance while keeping the fire stoked and occasionally providing fresh warm towels. By dawn, both cubs were alert, though the smaller one remained weaker than its sibling. The second day brought no relief from the storm. Snow had piled against the cabin in drifts higher than the windows, and the wind continued to howl with unrelenting force. Jack found himself settling into an improbable routine with his dangerous house guests. He discovered that the mother bear would accept offerings of food if he placed them on the floor and retreated. He provided honey, dried berries, and some preserved fish from his stores, watching in fascination as she carefully divided the food, ensuring her cubs ate first. "You're quite the mother," Jack observed from his chair, where he'd been documenting this extraordinary encounter with his camera. "Got names picked out for them, have you?" The bear looked up at the sound of his voice, her dark eyes revealing an intelligence that both humbled and awed him. In all his years photographing wildlife, Jack had never felt such a connection with his subjects. This wasn't observation from a blind or through a telephoto lens. This was coexistence, however temporary, with creatures he had spent his life admiring from a distance. By the afternoon of the second day, the smaller cub had improved dramatically. It played with its sibling on the cabin floor, their mother watching with what Jack could only interpret as relief. The scene was so domestic, so contrary to everything he knew about these powerful predators, that Jack almost forgot the danger inherent in their presence. Almost. A reminder came when he accidentally dropped a pan while preparing his own meal. The mother bear responded instantly, rising to her full height and issuing a warning growl that made the hair on Jack's neck stand on end. He froze, speaking in the same calm tone he'd been using since their arrival. "Just me being clumsy," he assured her. "No danger to your little ones." The bear settled after a tense moment, but Jack didn't forget again. This was not a domestic scene, no matter how it might appear. This was nature's temporary truce, born of necessity and desperation. As night fell again, Jack checked the weather report. The storm was weakening and would likely pass by morning. He felt an unexpected twinge of melancholy at the news. These creatures would return to the wild where they belonged, and he would have only photographs and an unbelievable story no one would likely believe. That night, as the wind finally began to subside, Jack dozed in his chair rather than retreating to his bedroom. He awoke to find the smallest cub sitting just a few feet away, watching him with curious eyes. "Hello there," Jack whispered, careful not to make sudden movements that might alarm the mother, who was asleep by the stove with the other cub. "Feeling better, are you?" The cub tilted its head, studying Jack with an intensity that seemed beyond its young age. Then, in a gesture that would stay with Jack forever, it approached him slowly and placed a small paw on his boot before quickly retreating to the safety of its family. "You're welcome," Jack said softly, his throat tight with emotion. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a transformed landscape buried under 4 feet of pristine snow. Jack opened his door to a world of blinding white and breathtaking silence. The mother bear approached the threshold, looking out at the forest beyond, then back at Jack. "Time to go home," he told her, stepping aside to give the family clear passage to the outside world. The bears left as they had arrived, the cubs first, bounding into the snow with renewed energy, followed by their watchful mother. At the edge of the tree line, the mother bear turned and rose on her hind legs, her massive silhouette stark against the white backdrop. She gazed back at the cabin for a long moment before dropping to all fours and disappearing into the forest with her cubs. Jack stood in the doorway until they were gone, then closed the door against the cold. The cabin seemed emptier than it ever had before. Spring came to Alaska with its usual suddenness. One day the world was locked in winter's grip, and the next, snowmelt was creating rivulets through the emerging grass and wildflowers. Jack had spent the intervening months sharing his extraordinary photographs with a select few colleagues who specialized in bear behavior. Their reactions ranged from disbelief to academic excitement, though all agreed that such an encounter was unprecedented. "You should have tranquilized them and called for extraction," Ellen Carstairs, a wildlife biologist from the University of Alaska, had scolded during one of their satellite phone conversations. "Think of what we could have learned." "They weren't research subjects," Jack had replied firmly. "They were living beings seeking shelter. I gave it to them. End of story." But it wasn't the end, not really. The encounter had changed something fundamental in Jack. His photographs from that winter focused less on capturing dramatic hunting scenes and more on the quiet moments of animal family life. Wolf pups playing under watchful parental eyes, lynx mothers teaching their young to hunt, the gentle guidance of moose calves by their mothers. By late June, Jack had assembled enough new material to warrant a trip into Whitethorn. He loaded his Jeep with memory cards and external hard drives containing thousands of images to be backed up on the computer at the small post office that doubled as his mail drop. The road to town, really more of a rough trail that had been cleared through the forest, wound through mountains that were now lush with summer growth. Jack drove slowly, windows down to enjoy the warm air and the scents of pine and wildflowers. He was about halfway to town, rounding a sharp bend that hugged a steep hillside, when he saw her. Standing in the middle of the narrow road, her massive form unmistakable, was the mother bear. Alone this time, her cubs nowhere in sight, she stood perfectly still as Jack braked to a halt about 30 yards away. "Hello, old girl," Jack murmured, reaching slowly for his camera on the passenger seat. "Fancy meeting you here." The bear made no move toward the Jeep, nor did she retreat into the forest. She simply watched, her dark eyes fixed on Jack with the same intelligence he remembered from those storm-bound days. Jack raised his camera, capturing her image against the backdrop of green forest and blue sky, so different from their first encounter. Through his viewfinder, he could see that she looked healthy, her coat glossy, her body well-fed from the summer's abundance. "Where are your little ones?" he asked, lowering the camera. "Off exploring while Mom takes a stroll?" As if in response, the bear suddenly rose onto her hind legs, her full height impressive and somewhat alarming even from the safety of the vehicle. She remained in that position for several seconds, then dropped back to all fours and took several deliberate steps toward the Jeep. Jack's hand moved instinctively toward the gearshift, ready to reverse if necessary, but something kept him from retreating. The bear's behavior didn't read as aggressive, it seemed purposeful. When she was about 15 yards from his vehicle, she stopped again, turned her head to look up at the hillside above the road, then looked back at Jack with what he could only describe as urgency. "What is it?" he asked, following her gaze to the steep slope above. That's when he noticed it, a slight movement in the earth, a trickling of small stones down the hillside where the winter's frost had weakened the soil structure. As he watched, the trickle became a flow, and the first large rock broke free from the slope. The realization hit Jack just as the bear let out a deep, rumbling sound unlike anything he had heard before. The hillside was giving way, a landslide was beginning directly above where his Jeep was parked. Without conscious thought, Jack threw the Jeep into reverse, pressing the accelerator hard. The vehicle lurched backward as the first large boulders crashed onto the spot where he had been moments before. Within seconds, the air was filled with dust and the deafening sound of tons of earth and rock cascading across the road, completely blocking the path forward. When the dust settled and the last rocks had tumbled to a stop, Jack sat shaking in his Jeep, hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. The landslide had buried exactly where he had been parked. Had he remained there even seconds longer, his vehicle, and he himself, would have been crushed. And the bear was gone. Jack stepped out of the Jeep on unsteady legs, surveying the wall of debris now blocking the road. There was no sign of the massive grizzly who had stood in his path just moments before, the same bear who had somehow known or sensed the impending danger and had, against all natural instinct, warned a human. "You saved my life," Jack said to the empty forest, his voice rough with emotion. "Just as I saved yours." It took nearly 2 hours for Jack to navigate an alternate route to Whitethorn, and another 3 hours of explaining to convince the local road maintenance crew that they needed to clear the landslide as soon as possible. By the time he had finished his business in town and headed back toward his cabin, taking the longer alternate route, the summer sun was beginning to set. As Jack approached the last mile before his cabin, he slowed the Jeep to a crawl. Something compelled him to stop at the small clearing that marked the halfway point of his property. Stepping out, he removed his backpack and extracted a jar of honey he'd purchased in town, a small luxury he occasionally enjoyed with his morning tea. After a moment's consideration, Jack opened the jar and poured its contents onto a flat rock at the edge of the clearing. He stepped back, surveying his offering in the golden light of the setting sun. "Thank you," he said simply, knowing his words were carried away by the gentle summer breeze. That night, as Jack sorted through the day's photographs, he paused on the image of the mother bear standing in the road. There was something in her eyes, something he had seen once before when she had placed her paws against his cabin window in the depths of winter's fury. An intelligence and awareness that transcended the boundaries humans so often place between themselves and the wild world. Over the following weeks, Jack found himself leaving small offerings at that same rock: honey, berries, occasionally fish. Sometimes they remained untouched, but more often than not, they were gone when he checked the next day. He never saw the bear during these visits, never attempted to wait and watch. This wasn't about observation or photography anymore. It was acknowledgement of a connection he could neither explain nor deny. As summer gave way to fall, Jack received a letter from National Geographic. They were interested in his winter bear photographs for a feature on unusual animal behaviors. The letter included an invitation to speak at a symposium in New York, his first trip back to civilization in nearly 2 years. Jack sat on his porch, the letter in hand, watching the forest as the afternoon light filtered through leaves that were beginning to turn gold and crimson. The thought of leaving, even temporarily, filled him with an unexpected reluctance. A movement at the forest edge caught his attention. There, partially obscured by undergrowth but unmistakable, stood the mother bear. Beside her were her cubs, no longer small and vulnerable but growing into their own strength, learning the ways of the forest under her guidance. The family didn't approach the cabin, nor did Jack move from his porch. They simply regarded each other across the distance that separated their worlds, a distance that had been briefly bridged during a winter storm and again on a mountain road. After a long moment, the mother bear turned and led her cubs deeper into the forest, disappearing among the trees that were their true home. Jack looked down at the letter again, then back to where the bears had stood. He would go to New York, would share his photographs and the carefully edited version of his story. But he would return to this place, to this life he had built on the edge of wilderness. Some might call him a recluse, hiding from human connection in favor of the solitude of nature. But Jack Lawson knew differently. Here, in this remote corner of Alaska, he had experienced one of the most profound connections possible. A moment of understanding and reciprocity with a creature from whom he should have been separated by the unbridgeable divide of species and instinct. The mother bear had taught him that such divides were perhaps not as absolute as humans believed. In the face of necessity, in moments of shared vulnerability, the boundaries between beings could dissolve, revealing a simpler truth, that all living creatures were bound together in ways that transcended language and reason. And sometimes, just sometimes, they could reach across those boundaries to save each other. In the gathering twilight, Jack placed the letter on the porch railing and walked to the edge of his property. There, he stood silently, listening to the forest as it prepared for night. Somewhere within those trees, a mother bear was leading her cubs to their den, teaching them the ways of survival in a world that was often harsh and unforgiving, but also a world where, on rare and precious occasions, unexpected kindness could emerge from the most unlikely sources, be it from a human opening his door to desperate creatures in a storm, or a bear warning a man of danger on a mountain road. A world where, perhaps, such kindness was not so unexpected after all.